So Revelation chapter 11 is where we're up to. Revelation 11, and we were talking about or rather I was talking about the two witnesses, and you can check that out if you're watching this on video. It's on the video before this. So today we're up to verse 11. I'm going to do verses 11 through to and including verse 14, which I shall read out to you. So Revelation 11. And starting at verse 11. And after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. And they heard a great voice from heaven, saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. And the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell. And in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted, and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. So, it's been difficult, some of the parts here of Revelation, particularly the one around this idea of the two witnesses, and where I was saying I don't believe it's literally two people, that there's a lot of figurative kind of language, and I do appreciate that at times you've probably gone home with a bit of a headache thinking, oh, I can't understand all this. But bear this in mind, there are people who've been Christians 30 or 40 years who have absolutely no idea what the book of Revelation is about. In fact, they probably don't even read it. Or worse than that, they attach some completely crazy, just out there meaning to it. So it is, even though we have to kind of probably work a bit harder with the book of Revelation than we do with other books of the Bible, at least it should help to fix in your mind, at least you've got a workable a workable interpretation of it, which is in line with the historic teaching of the church. It's not something, you're not like going, oh yeah, maybe the Antichrist, that could be Joe Biden, or you know what I mean? It's kind of like you've got to have something that is in line with the teaching of the Protestant church, of kind of Bible believing Christians. You can't just like go out on a limb and come up with all sorts of crazy ideas. And that's what I've tried to do here, is to try whenever possible to tie it in to the majority view of the historic Orthodox Church. And when I've sort of said, I don't really know what that could be, I've tried to be honest and say I don't know. And I think that's helpful. So I'll emphasize again, by asking the question, how much of this is literal, how much is symbolic or metaphorical? Since almost everything that we've read in Revelation so far has been the language of prophecy, it's been the language of visions, hasn't it? Kind of dreamlike language. I suspect that much of this is not literal. And there are 3 reasons this evening that I'm going to share with you why I think this is more symbolic. And the first reason is the language of verse 11. The language of verse 11 is almost a direct quote from Ezekiel 37:10. Do you remember the valley of dry bones, where God says to the prophet, can these bones live? And Ezekiel says, you know, Lord. And there's a sound of kind of rushing wind and so on. And in Ezekiel 37 verse 10 it says, and they lived, that is the bones, and stood up upon their feet. So it's almost exactly what it says. And they, here in verse 11, and they stood up upon their feet. They stood upon their feet. So it's almost exactly the same kind of language. And of course, in Ezekiel's vision, Ezekiel's vision is well, it's a vision, isn't it? It's not. The vision he's saying, that's not it. It's representing something else. It's representing Israel. And so here, I think because that language is used, that in the same way, it's representing something else. So what could this rising up of the witnesses actually represent? We'll go to Romans chapter 8. Romans 8. Romans 8 and verse 16. You know these verses. Romans 8, verse 16. The Spirit itself, or His self, bear witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with Him, that we may be also glorified together. So this concerns the true children of God, those who cry Abba Father, it says a little bit earlier on, doesn't it, in Romans 8. So these are the true children of God, those who maintain the true twofold witness of God. Remember I said the two witnesses, the twofold witness, spirit and truth. Anybody who does that will be persecuted just as Christ was, but will also be glorified just as Christ was. So I think it's a deliberate drawing together of those ideas. These witnesses were persecuted, and now they're going to be glorified. So this peculiar sort of particular persecution is for a limited time, isn't it? It says here. I think it's said 3.5 days or something. I'm not going to speculate on that, except to say it's in a limited place, Jerusalem, and it be for a limited time that God has decided. God has decided, right, it's going to end here. They're going to be persecuted. Yes, I'm going to allow them to be killed, and yes, then I'm going to raise them up. It's a reminder, it's an encouragement to the church. Reason 2 why I think this is symbolic and not just kind of literal. Again, the glorification is deliberately linked to the language that's used of Christ Himself. So, for example, Revelation 11, verse 12 says, "And they heard a great voice from heaven, saying to them, 'Come up hither.' And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them." So they ascended up into heaven in a cloud. Again, Acts 1 verse 9, we have this idea of Christ Himself ascending up in a cloud. So it's a deliberate kind of connection, isn't it, in the imagery that's being used here, sort of saying like Christ was persecuted, but He was glorified. You are being persecuted, but don't forget, you also will be glorified because you're in Christ, And I think that's what it's really saying here. It's an encouragement. Christ's ascension, it says He was taken up, and a cloud received Him out of their sight. So a deliberate back reference into Christ Himself. And of course, when Christ returns, He will descend in a cloud. That's what we're told in the scriptures, and how that fantastic hymn, "Lo, He comes in clouds descending," Charles Wesley wrote. So let's just kind of, I hope that helps in terms of understanding this. I do think it's largely symbolic. I do think it's a deliberate connecting of Revelation 11 to other verses in the scriptures, and I do think perhaps the purpose of it is to encourage a persecuted church, or encourage a church that may be persecuted in the future. So if we reduce the vision of the two witnesses to its basic chronology, and if we put it in the context of the six trumpets, which run from about Revelation chapter 8 to Revelation chapter 11, I'll just give just a little recap for you. So the first trumpet, if you remember, was hail and fire mixed with blood. The second trumpet was the mountain thrown into the sea. The third trumpet was the star named Wormwood. The fourth trumpet was a third of the sun, moon, and the stars that were struck. The fifth trumpet was the locusts. The sixth trumpet was the release of the four angels at the river Euphrates, I think. And carrying on with the sixth trumpet, because it lasts a bit longer, doesn't it? There's also the angel and the small book or scroll, and then following on with the two witnesses, which we've been looking at. Not last week, was it? Because we missed last week, but the week before that. So let's have a little, again, a chronology of what happens here with the witnesses. The witnesses prophesy. When their testimony is finished, the beast rises from the bottomless pit. The witnesses are killed. Their bodies are left in the streets, and their enemies celebrate. And then God resurrects them, and great fear falls on their enemies. Now, Matthew Henry, who's a well-known Bible commentator of yesteryear, he says, "It will be no small part of the punishment of persecutors, both in this day and at the great day," means the great day of judgment when Christ returns, "that they see the faithful servants of God honoured and advanced." That's his comment on this passage. So he's sort of saying these two witnesses are symbolic of faithful witnesses everywhere, and that one day, yes, the enemies of God will see that they are glorified, that God's people are glorified, that those who they've persecuted are glorified. So I think that this is what you might call allegorical, parabolic, fancy words like that, like a parable. In other words, it's not necessarily literal, but it illustrates what will happen on that great day to the true witnesses of God. Just turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 5. John 5. I was going to think I'd go a bit early, but I won't. I'll go from verse 28. This is Jesus speaking. He says, "Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, in which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation," or judgment. That's what the word means. So it's a reminder, that those who are faithful and true witnesses of God will be resurrected to life everlasting. And those who have been, particularly those who have been the persecutors of God's people, will be resurrected to judgment. There'll be two resurrections, if you like. Those who are in the grave will come alive, and then they will stand before God, and He will judge them fairly, with equality. So it's imagine if you're being persecuted for being a Christian. Imagine if you've seen somebody killed, cut short. I mean, I always think of, although I wasn't there, William Tyndale. William Tyndale was an English Bible translator. He was a brilliant man, and he most of our English, well, certainly this Bible, is based on William Tyndale's work. But he never finished his work because he was martyred. He was burnt to death. But his cause, that is the translating of the Bible into English, continued after he died. And his legacy of what he was. It wasn't a tragedy because others took up, what he'd done and continued the work. And I think, when you see people killed for being Christians, for witnessing to the truth, if they have been faithful, it's not a tragedy. They've, in fact, was it in the Salvation Army, when you used to die, they used to say, they didn't say, oh, he's died or she's died. They'd say, oh, they've been promoted to glory, which is a great way of saying it, So that's kind of what's happening here. Yeah, they're being promoted to glory. So kind of finishing off really now, verse 13. Going back to Revelation now. Verse 13, and the same hour there was a great earthquake, and a tenth part of the city fell. So again, we're left with the idea, is this an actual earthquake? Is it a physical shaking of of the ground, or is it illustrative of something else? Is it an actual earthquake, or is it the coming of some vast army? Could it represent the Sassanids or the Muslims or the Turks who came later? I don't know. Is a simple answer. I don't really know. I don't really read of any literal earthquake taking place in Jerusalem at a particular time, which makes me think that I suspect it's symbolic. And this is the third reason really why I believe that these are allegories, symbols, whatever language you want to use, because we read that 7,000 were killed, 7,000 were slain, which is the exact number of those that did not bow the knee to Baal or Baal in 1 Kings 19:18. So 7,000 faithful witnesses could be what it's talking about. I think it's most likely figurative. But the death of these witnesses acts as a warning to the rest of the church, or the remnant as they're called here, and they glorify God out of fear. And yes, that is sometimes what happens, isn't it? Sometimes either the death or the persecution of real Christians, those who are maybe backslidden Christians or not quite as involved, it can suddenly have that kind of wake up call, isn't it? It wakes them up. And this is what seems to happen here. There's fear, and they glorify God. They were affrighted. The remnant were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. Then verse 14. I like verse 14 because it tells us exactly where we're up to in this kind of series of events. Do you remember there were 7 trumpets that were going to be blown, and there were 3 woes that came right at the end? Yeah, and so it says here in verse 14, the second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. So 7th trumpet and the third woe. So again, if you don't mind me quoting another commentator, quoting John Wesley, he now pulls it back to this historical chronology that we've been looking at. You know, what's happening in Constantinople, what's happening in Jerusalem, the early kind of life of the church. And this is what he says. He says, the butchery made by the Saracens ceased. It stopped about the year 847 AD, when their power was so broken by Charles the Great, which I think is Charlemagne, that they never recovered it. Now, he's not saying Charlemagne was still ruling then, but I guess what he's saying is the effects of his achievements are still being felt. They've kind of caused now the breaking of this power of the Saracens, and now the seventh trumpet and of course the third and final woe are going to come, and that's what we're going to be looking at, God willing, next week.